We are here, thank you guys for coming. We are here to talk about what can be done to reverse hate in America. We
Small
can just do this in like
topic.
a speed round, right? One word answers. No, it's obviously not a joke. We couldn't come together for this conversation at a more auspicious time. I mean, just yesterday, we see this news of a 29-year-old father stabbed on his way to Shul before dawn. A couple days earlier, the news of this manifesto at Syracuse University. Earlier last month, I guess, the AJC released a survey that 1 in 4 Jews in America are afraid to go to places or events because of their Judaism, because they're afraid something will happen. 31% are now afraid to show displays of their Judaism. And, you know, it's been a year since Pittsburgh, where 11 worshipers were killed on Shabbat at services. And it seems like every other week, or every week, there's something on Twitter about some Orthodox Jew in Brooklyn being beat up with some horrible video. So I want to start, Brett, by asking you to help us put this moment in context. Feels like it's worse than anybody can remember in their lifetime, but help us understand, where does this fit into the longer history of anti-Semitism? And not just in volume, but in sort of nature. Does it feel like this is a different kind of anti-Semitism, different intensity, coming from a different source?
I mean, much of the anti-Semitism now travels under names it didn't use before, but then again, anti-Semitism was itself a name for what we really should be speaking about, which is Jew hatred. And Jew hatred is a shape-shifting phenomenon that targets the Jews either on account of their religion or on account of their quote-unquote race or on account of their so-called cosmopolitanism or internationalism, and then on account of their nationalism, you know, which is to say, my view is that anti-Zionism is the modern face of most anti-Semitism, not all anti-Semitism, but most anti-Semitism. And that's a point I think that's worth underscoring. But let me add one other point, which is that I think anti-Semitism or Jew hatred is sort of downstream from a number of other factors in the way that cholera is downstream from people who are befouling, you know, the water somewhere else. And it's worth thinking about the ways in which the waters are being befouled. A point that I know BARI often makes is that anti-Semitism, among other things, is a conspiracy theory. And so we are now living in a world in which sort of traditional norms about rationality and how we know things are being upset by all kinds of factors and turbocharged by the technologies of social media. And so conspiracy theories now have a purchase in everyday political life that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago when people sort of hew to kind of common standards of rationality. So why are we seeing so much more anti-Semitism? In part because it's one conspiracy among the many that we are seeing. Another aspect is a new populist hatred of elites, in particular economic elites. So again, it's not entirely surprising that when you are railing against globalists, the Davos crowd, and so on, some segment of that is going to end up alighting on the Jews as the sort of quintessential economically successful elite. And the third aspect is there is this new hatred of minorities and of immigrants. And again, the Jews as a minority and often an immigrant community are going to be the targets of that. So we have to be mindful not only of anti-Semitism, the disease, just as we are mindful of cholera, the disease, but we have to go back a few steps and say, well, what is feeding this? And what's feeding it is a new kind of irrationalism, hatred of minorities, and hatred of success, envy of success, that all combines uniquely to find and target the Jews.
BARI, in your book, which
That was so good.
yeah, that's okay. Thank you. That was good. Thanks. BARI, you've been out speaking about anti-Semitism everywhere, and you have this very well-selling book. which I think is available here at this conference. And in the book, you talk about these 3 different strains or sources of anti-Semitism, the kind of alt-right white supremacist version, the Islamist version, and anti-Semitism of the left. And since its publication, you've taken quite a bit of crap from the left for making these things seem equal, right? For the idea that for people who are saying, you know, on the right and from Islamists, we see people getting killed or beaten up by anti-Semitism, and on the left, it's mostly about, you know, cartoons, offensive cartoons, or comments on Twitter. How can you possibly make them equal? But what I guess I want to ask you is why you think everyone's so caught up in this question of, is it worse on the right or left, instead of focusing on digging into the sources on the right and left and how they're different and what we might do about them. Is this just part of this sort of hopeless polarization that we see all over politics and all over the Jewish world, or what do you think's going on there?
I think a few things, and I'll leave it to Eric to, as I know he'll do, brilliantly explain white supremacy and the role, as he's written, that Jews play as sort of the linchpin in that ideology. So I'll leave that to the side for a minute. To be super clear, as I feel like I need to be, given the criticism you referenced, there's no question in my mind that the most lethal form of anti-Semitism against Jews right now in America comes from the far right. God forbid if someone was going to walk into this room or walk into the synagogue where I go on Friday night, the money is good on the bet that that person is, you know, of the same ilk as the man that walked into a Tree of Life on October 27th. That said, you know, we all have 2 eyes. The notion that we somehow need to be blind to anti-Semitism when it comes from the far left is baffling to me, but I think it sort of makes sense when you step back a little bit, which is to say, when the anti-Semitism comes from the far right, most American Jews, right, 75% of American Jews vote for Democrats, the overwhelming majority of American Jews identify as liberals and progressives, so when anti-Semitism comes from the far right, it's pointing over there. That person is not part of us. That person's not at our kitchen table. That person's not sitting next to us in a university classroom. That person's not inside of our political tent. And so it is, I think, emotionally and psychologically easier to see that threat. It's also more stark and blunt about what it is. It announces itself. The man who walked into Tree of Life walked in and said, "All Jews must die." And then he tried to kill as many Jews as possible. So there's also, we don't need to have a Talmudic debate about all Jews must die. That's very, very clear. And any reasonable person of conscience, you know, can recognize the evil of that. I think anti-Semitism from the left is harder in a number of ways. One is that it pretends to be what it's not. In other words, it announces itself as social justice, as progress, as anti-racism. And it's in that way, it smuggles itself into the mainstream, including in many circles that American Jews see themselves as not just being part of, but really at the heart of, which is progressive movements for social justice, which we've long prided ourselves as being a part of. So that's one aspect of it. I think the other aspect of it is what I was referring to before, which is what happens when the people that you thought you were aligned with, that you were in a coalition with, are the people that are threatening you. And I think that is just very, very difficult for the Jewish community to confront. And as a result, I think that there's been an inordinate focus on anti-Semitism from the far right, which again is the most lethal threat, but not from the far left, which only seeks to marginalize us. But to suggest that that's not serious, you know, you have to have just a tremendous lack of moral and political imagination. All we need to do is look at England right now, in this moment, to see where it can go. All we need to do is look at the news just out of the University of Toronto, where Hillel wanted to provide kosher food in the cafeteria, but they were denied the kosher food. Why? Because Hillel is a pro-Israel organization. I'm sorry, but anti-Semitism that begins with marginalization is absolutely deathly, maybe not to Jewish bodies immediately, but to the Jewish soul. And the most obvious recent example of this, of course, is the Soviet Union. And if you want to tell me or tell Natan Sharansky that that kind of anti-Semitism isn't morally serious, I'm sorry, you're not morally serious.
Eric, I'm going to turn to you in just a second, Eric, but I want to not skip over something that Brett said, Because I think if I heard you right, you said that you think the anti-Semitism of the left is the largest amount. And I just wonder if that's what you meant to say, or is it more what BARI, I mean, is it more about the level of perniciousness? Do you think there's actually more anti-Semitism on the left than on the right?
Did I say that?
I'm not positive. I thought that's what I heard.
I'm not sure
Okay.
I'm not sure I said that. I mean, one point
You
that,
said most anti-Semitism these days comes in the guise of anti-Zionism.
yes.
And I think that's correct.
I think
Okay.
that's right. I'm not talking about lethality. I'm talking about ubiquity. And I think it's important, just very briefly, to point out, I think what BARI said was so important, but the left is now trying, the far left, is now trying to create a distinction between anti-Zionism as a legitimate political expression and anti-Semitism as an illegitimate one. And it does two things, that effort at separation does two things which are, I think, really very insidious. Number one, it legitimizes anti-Zionism, which on its own terms, even if you could separate it from anti-Semitism, is a foul ideology. Because saying that one country should not exist, anti-Zionism isn't criticism of Israel. Anti-Zionism is the view that Israel should not exist. Even if you could pretend that that had nothing to do with the fact that it's a Jewish state, that is an extraordinarily violent and aggressive political proposition. So it is, on the one hand, legitimizing something that shouldn't be legitimized, but it is also providing cover to every anti-Semite who suddenly realizes that the only thing he needs to do to gain a measure of political respectability is to cloak his anti-Semitism in anti-Zionism.
We're gonna get back to that in just a sec. But Eric, I want you to help us connect anti-Semitism and the broader questions of hatred and white supremacy. You've written the sort of seminal work showing how anti-Semitism really undergirds the ideology of white supremacy. And I'd love you to walk everybody sort of through that, and then also talk about, it seems like what's happening now, and to some extent Brett was hinting at this, is that Jews and Israelis in particular are being accused of white supremacy, despite the fact that anti-Semitism is the undergirding philosophy. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that too.
Yes, and I'm going to do it in 30 seconds.
We have a few minutes.
Good morning, everyone. It's humbling to be on the stage and in this conversation. 5, 10 years ago, I dreamed about these kinds of conversations, these types of debates and fights that are taking place on social media and in meetings. And so regardless of the different points of opinion we're going to hear, the one thing I want to say is that I hope we all understand and realize that for the very first time, America is having a real debate and conversation on anti-Semitism, and at a scale that just hasn't existed in the present day, and that means something. What I want to say first is, when we talk about anti-Semitism, we talk about white supremacy, we speak about white nationalism, the first thing to understand is that these are terms that have real meaning. And we currently live in a society that conflates terms and meanings in ways that actually aren't useful. And in areas where we don't have knowledge, we often fill it in with tropes and stereotypes. I liken it to when I moved up from Los Angeles, 5 generations Los Angeles right here, right? And when I was young, around 22, I moved up to Eugene, Oregon. I'm pretty sure I called it Oregon then, right? With 5 friends. And I remember when my friend first asked me, did I want to move to Oregon? And I looked at them with the love that one has for friends, and I said to myself, absolutely not, right? Why would I ever leave Los Angeles? And if you could have looked inside of my head, what you would have seen, right, was San Francisco, a lot of trees, and the Space Needle, which isn't even in Oregon, right? I had no idea of what Oregon looked like or what it meant. I remember, I can say now, embarrassingly enough, asking my friends, Was there electricity? Did they have cable, right? Pretty silly now. But I had just never been to Oregon. And so I filled in blanks with things that I thought spoke to Oregon, like Little House on the Prairie and others. I mentioned this, right? There's a point to this story beside it being a funny story, which is it is time for us to reframe the debate on anti-Semitism. What's happening in the country is we are having a debate on anti-Semitism through the lens of 1920s, 1930s anti-Semitism. And that is insufficient in terms of how we measure the importance of this moment. And I would liken it as an African American as having present day conversations and measuring it up against the mass wave of lynchings that took place in the late 1800s and early 1900s. If you were to ask me today, is racism towards the black community a serious problem? And then made me compare it, right, to the wave of lynchings in that period, I would likely come up short. But like all forms of bigotry, anti-Semitism has evolved. And this brings us to the question of what does it mean in this time, and I'm going to do this really quickly. White supremacy is a system. It is a historic system that is part of the founding of this country. We may not like it, but that is part of who we are. That system was based off of historic racism, the genocide of indigenous people. White nationalism is something different. White nationalism is a social movement. If white supremacy was about exploitation, and we can take a deep breath, none of us were here for the founding of that nation, right? None of us are responsible for the foundation of white supremacy. But in the same way, white nationalism also doesn't see itself as part of that white supremacist system. And that's where we fail to understand this modern form of anti-Semitism, which is this. If white supremacy was about exploitation, white nationalism at its core is about ethnic cleansing, the forced removal of Jews and people of color from the United States. It does not seek to take us back to the days of Gone with the Wind. It also sees white supremacy as a failed project. It has anchored its worldview within anti-Semitism. It is the paper that explains to them the world and its opposition. Where the left has fallen short is not understanding that there is really no left or right anti-Semitism. There is merely anti-Semitism in America, right? It is not just a behavior, but a system of ideas and ideology. And it is in the air we breathe. To act as if anti-Semitism isn't in the left is just ridiculous. It can be tapped into just as white nationalists tap into it. The danger of unacknowledged left anti-Semitism, though, is this. It is that human rights and civil rights organizations have been traditionally the organizations that draw a moral barrier against bigotry in our society. And its unwillingness to truly sit down and understand the modern functionings of anti-Semitism, wherever it may appear, has left this entire society in vulnerable communities at risk and has undercut our ability to save our democracy at a time when it is under attack. And that sits on us. I sit firmly within the camp of the left. That is my history, and we are falling short right now, and we are stumbling dangerously around anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
I was just gonna like have a quick follow-up to Eric, which is, it seems to me that the animating idea right now on the far left is this idea of intersectionality, which we have 15 minutes, so without going into the theory of intersectionality, the way it seems to me that it functions in practice is that it says, we're gonna reverse the caste system that we've been living in Western civilization up until about 5 minutes ago, where people like John Hamm were at the top of that caste system, and a disabled black transgender person is at the very bottom. Now we're flipping that caste system. John Hamm is at the bottom, and the Jews, who at least in America, appear to be white, they're privileged, they're successful, and all of the rest, they have no claim to victimhood. It seems to me that that idea disallows for the recognition of anti-Semitism on the left itself. And I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, so I'm a child of intersectionality, right? And the way that I would think about it in practice and in theory, right, is that it was created around the idea, right, that black women in American society, based off of almost every data point we can look at, health, education, economics, were the faces at the bottom of the well, right?
Oh yeah, the GM case.
That's
yes.
right. And that by lifting up the most vulnerable in our society, that we would strengthen overall society. However, like every movement, right, every community and every society, ideologies are imperfect. We could have a conversation up here about any ideology and talk about its theory versus practice. Practice usually falls short. What we should understand about intersectionality, though, is that it was created not to create a new hierarchy of oppression, right? It was created for folks to find a way to empower themselves in a society where they are deeply disempowered, right? But it was supposed to go on. And that's where, for me, we have stumbled as a left. The purpose of intersectionality wasn't merely to remind ourselves of our own humanity, but to build strength within ourselves so that we could recognize the humanity of others. And in the world of anti-Semitism and racism, right, the failure on the left is the idea that race is actually a binary biological definition. Some elements of the left have fallen short by buying into the hype that there is a real biological definition of race in America, rather than a social construct that was created, right, to manage a society based off the idea that a group of people were inferior, another group were superior, simply based off their skin color.
It's really, thank you. I want to get back to the question about anti-Zionism and particularly anti-Zionist Jews, and how Jewish organizations, individual Jews, people at this conference, sort of what do we do about them? What do we do with them? How do we think about them? And I think, right, you talked about anti-Zionism as being singling Israel out and saying this country shouldn't exist. I think, to be fair, the idea that a Jewish democracy, a nation state of the Jewish people, an ethnocracy like that they think that is immoral, and they're opposing it on the basis of how it was founded, not, there shouldn't be any Israel or any particular state. But in any case, what do we do about, how do you regard the inclusion of anti-Zionists and anti-Zionism in the Jewish debate? And what do you do about the fact that this small but very vocal, active minority of American Jews are often used, as I think Brett talked about, as a cudgel against other Jews, to attack other Jews? And also the fact that some of the people leading that movement are people who, went to Ramaz and other day schools and were products of the American Jewish community and institutions. So I wonder how everybody thinks we should deal with it.
I mean, my attitude is really, I feel very sorry for them. I mean, it's clearly, these are people who have, in one way or another, been profoundly misled. And they have been misled in a way that has produced a they are, I think, usually unwittingly, have become votaries of hatred, and they are often being used, and then they are slow to figure out that they are being used. I think you saw an example of that to some extent with the Women's March, when suddenly it dawned on some of the Jewish members, I don't know if they were anti-Zionist, but they were clearly of the pretty far left, that their sisters in the Women's March really didn't have an objection to, I don't know, Israeli occupation in the West Bank or whatever it is. They had an objection to Jews as, you know, so-called slaveholders and so on. When I am on campus and I'm talking to students, and there's usually some group of, you know, SJP students, I know there's some Jewish students, and what I say to them is I say, I know you're idealists. I know that in your mind you are fighting for justice, but you are actually fellow travelers of some of the most vicious bigots around today. And I assure you that in 10 or 20 years' time, if you're a thinking person, you are going to profoundly regret what you are doing now, because you are participating, without even knowing it, as a useful idiot, in the demonization of the Jewish state by people who wish its eradication and its destruction. So bear that in mind, and I think that's really a much more useful attitude, not only wiser, but more useful than simply screaming at them and calling them self-hating Jews. You know, I'm sorry for you, I'm sorry for your parents, your partner probably is embarrassed, and you should rethink it. I think that's probably a wiser course. Now, it is true that in the guise of, I'm using the old Soviet term, the useful idiot, they are doing something that is uniquely obnoxious and dangerous. I mean, read any anti-Semitic tract. Read Osama bin Laden, and Osama bin Laden will say, well, Noam Chomsky says X, Y, and Z about the Zionist state. And other, the David Dukes of the world love picking on Ilan Pappé and other, you know, anti-Zionist Israelis as kind of evidence that what they're saying is said by other Jews who are, in their view, quote, courageous enough to know the truth. And so there is that side which is pernicious. But I think the wiser course is to simply say, I know you're an idealist, and I'm begging you to reconsider, because what you're really doing is you're lending your voice to bigots.
I'll just add two short things. One is that I think that Jews, and historically this has always been true, Jews can be involved in movements that put the target on the backs of other Jews. Stephen Miller is involved in one such project right now. Anti-Zionist Jews are involved in it in another way, and I think we need to be clear-eyed about that. I also think, look, there are lots of people in the world who wish that Israel never came into existence. Many of those people are Jews, and many of those people, not many, but a goodly number, we know a bunch of them, they live in New York.
You can find them on Twitter.
Yeah, I know a lot of them. I think that you can have that view, that's fine, but you cannot tell me that there is any kind of moral equivalence between being an anti-Zionist in 1920s Poland and being an anti-Zionist today. Israel exists. Israel has the largest population of Jews on planet Earth, and I don't see how being opposed to the existence or the safety or the security of that state, and I'm not talking about criticism of Israeli government policy, I don't see how that is not anti-Semitic in effect, if not in intent. I think one of the problems, though, is that BDS, you know, a lot of people in the organized Jewish community pat themselves on the back and they say, BDS has never been adopted by an American university. They are deluding themselves. That may be true, but BDS has become a normative plank of far-left politics. Not even far-left, left-wing politics. If you're an 18-year-old and you go to an activities fair on an elite American university campus the first week, you sign up for all of these progressive clubs. You sign up for raising the minimum wage to $15 and legalizing pot and better wages for cafeteria workers. Oh, and by the way, BDS. The student signing up for that, of course they're not an anti-Semite. They don't really know what BDS is about. And if anything, they're probably being told that it's actually just about the end of the occupation in the West Bank, which is a lie. The point is that it has become a sort of normal plank of political progressivism, and that is absolutely unacceptable. If you step back from it and you're like, hold on, it has become normal to support a movement that says that one state in the world does not deserve to exist. That is lunacy, and we need to be calling that out at every single turn.
Can I just add? You know, I'm very glad you mentioned Stephen Miller, because this also has to be pointed out on the right. And I feel my responsibility as someone who is to the right of center is to spend more of my effort calling out the right than it is to call out the left. So when I hear when I hear Jews who are on the right endorsing Donald Trump, and I raise the issue of Trump's attitude towards immigration, I often hear, well, you know, immigrants these days aren't like immigrants, you know, when we came. I'm like, what did you arrive as a
hedge funder?
You arrived in first class? I mean, give me a break. And I really mean this. You know, later on today, as this place is being cleared out, there will be people here who are going to be clearing up the chairs, picking up trash. Look at those people. Those are your grandparents. Those are your grandparents. My grandfather arrived here from the Kishinev pogrom. His father was a carpenter in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. My mother arrived here as a refugee with $7 to her name. And today, because of the greatness of America, Tucker Carlson, the son of Ambassador Richard Carlson, accuses me of being an out-of-touch elitist. And I think this is the greatest country in the world, that I can be accused of being this hopeless elitist, one generation away from steerage class, displaced person, refugee. That's worth pointing out.
Thank you. As the clock ticks down, I just want to make sure we get back to the title of our panel, Eric. So the title is What Can Be Done to Reverse Hate in America? And I want you to help us think about what's ever worked to mitigate hate. And I want to think about this, you know, on a national level, a policy level, a community level, and down to a personal individual level. What is a responsible individual, country, community to do?
So I will just say this. We have to hold that in the last 2 years, over 100 Americans have been murdered by white nationalists. That is significant. That tells us a little bit about the moment we are in. And I don't want to just make it about the physical violence. It is the shift in narrative. Anti-Semitism isn't just an attack on the Jewish community. Anti-Semitism is historically used, right, to undercut belief in democratic practice, right? And we have to remember that. What do we do? Quickly. One, you have to start having conversations. You have to have conversations that aren't grounded in what we would call on the left, call-out culture. If you start the conversation by on anti-Semitism by calling people anti-Semites, I can tell you the conversation is likely not going to go very far. In the same way as if I start a conversation on racism by calling you a racist, we're probably not going to meld, right? Second, the most important thing that could happen is getting elected officials to understand, A, anti-Semitism is an issue of concern, 2, that we expect them to speak up and to speak out and be clear that they will not utilize anti-Semitism as part of their partisan politics. It is crucial. After 9/11, hate crimes targeting people who are perceived to be Muslim rose significantly. In the first weekend, there were 3 murders following September 11th. Those hate crimes continued to climb until John Ashcroft and George W. Bush took to the airwaves and said hate crimes will not be tolerated against American Muslims. There was a direct correlation to the drop-off of hate crimes following that. What elected officials say matters in this moment, and their silence opens up the space for anti-Semitic violence and the weakening of our democracy. Speak up and speak out now.
Barry, Barry, jump in here. What is the young person supposed to do when they're at the college fair and they see that sign up about BDS? Or what are we supposed to do when they come home and ask us about it at, dinner, at Thanksgiving? Or, what are you supposed to do if you see a swastika on the subway or on somebody's tattoo, or when you see something on Twitter that feels uncomfortable? What do you do on an individual level?
I'll just talk for a moment, I think, about the radical shift in mindset that I think we need in our community, and I think the young people in our community are the leaders of our community in this regard, which is to say, if someone calls you a pig, do you stand up on the street corner and say, "I'm not a pig, I'm actually a human being"? That has been too much of the strategy, the institutional strategy in our community, which is to say, we play defense. We let people come and attack us, and then we insist on our humanity. The Jewish people, we did not survive to 5780 or 2019, depending on how you count, because we stood on street corners insisting that we weren't what our haters said. We cannot survive if we're going to use this precarious moment we're in to simply become anti-Semites. I don't want to be a part of a civilization, a religion, a culture, a people that makes that our reason for being. We need a very, very, in a profound way, to think about, okay, I wrote a book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. It's good. I hope it helps you. But in order for that to be meaningful, you need to know what you are fighting for. The Jewish students that are waging this fight most effectively, the ones that are capable of unbelievable courage and bravery, are the people that know what they are fighting for. It's like Viktor Frankl said in his unbelievable book. You can withstand any how if you have the why. We need the why. We need to be giving our kids the why. Without that, absolutely nothing is possible.
Brett, it's your birthday. You get the last word, and then it's going to be over. So,
I'll just very briefly say, about 10 years ago, there was an African-American singer named CeeLo Green who had a hit song that is unrepeatable.
No, it's repeatable. Sing it.
Well, I can't, but...
oh, come on.
But it begins with an F, it ends with a U, but the important point is not that it's a slur. The point is that he says it with such joy in his heart. And really, it's about saying to your enemies that, but we're so much better. We wish you well. Go away. Our lives continue in this magnificent way. We haven't forgotten to tell you off. We're not being unmindful of who our enemies are on both sides of the political divide. But I think Barry's word is the right one. Above all, we are proud of the people we are and the people we're becoming.